Hi everyone, thank you for joining me and happy Pollinator Week. I am here today to talk about pollinators in decline, why it matters and we must do about it. My name is Anna Walker and I work at the New Mexico Biopark Society. Hi everyone, thank you for joining me and happy Pollinator Week. I am here today to talk about pollinators in decline, why it matters and we must do about it. My name is Anna Walker and I work at the New Mexico Biopark. Hi everyone, thank you. Sorry, not sure what happened there. Estrellita, is this working properly?
I can hear you, Anna. I can hear you through Zoom.
Okay, maybe it's all right. Let's try this again. All right. So, like I was saying,
there you go, technical difficulties. So if any of you guys have it playing in the background, go ahead and mute that video. Just have the video up, but turn your audio off.
Okay. I think I just closed that window, so hopefully we're good to go now. All right, so again, my name is Anna Walker and I work at the New Mexico Biopark Society. I am one of 3 species survival officers here. My small team and I work in partnership with the IUCN to assess the conservation status of different insects or different species around the globe. One of my coworkers works on medicinal plants, another one works on freshwater fishes, and I work specifically with invertebrate pollinators. So I have been spending a lot of time over the last year since I've been here reading about different insects in decline, so I'm quite happy to share with you today what I've learned in that time. So to start out with, before we jump into the pollinator stuff, which is really why we're here today, I'd like to just kind of provide some context about insects and why they're so important in ecosystems. There are slightly over 1 million species of described insects, and that is a lot. There are only 1.6 million described species total, including things like plants and vertebrates and fungi. So the fact that over 1 million of them are insects, that's, you know, around 2/3 of all species are insects. That's a huge, huge number. Arthropods, which include insects, but also closely related things like crabs and spiders and millipedes and centipedes. Put together, they weigh 17 times more than the globe's 7.5 billion people. So as you can see, that's quite a substantial amount of biomass that insects and their relatives comprise. We are all very familiar with insects because they are in all of the freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. They are everywhere. So one of the things I wanted to touch on just a little bit is what makes insects so successful. Well, they were one of the first animal groups to colonize land more than 400 million years ago. So they've really had a lot of time to diversify. Their small size also enables them to take advantage of a high number of niches within the environments that they inhabit. They also have very fast generation times, which enables them to adapt to change quite readily compared to some other species groups. And then they also undergo metamorphosis, or a large number of them do. And this is really important because it allows the adults and the other stages, like the larval stage, to take advantage of different resources in an environment. So let's talk a little bit about why insects matter beyond the pollination ecosystem services that they provide. So one really important thing that insects do is they provide food for other animals. This includes things like birds and lizards and most vertebrates. It also includes other insects, and insects are also a very important food source for a lot of people around the world. They're a really important protein source for some cultures. They also decompose dead plants and animals. If you've ever found a dead animal in your backyard, you may have noticed the large number of maggots, which are larval flies that may be coming out of it. This is really important for helping remove that carcass from your yard and returning those nutrients back to the soil. This dung beetle up here, one example of why something like this might be really important. When they first introduced cattle to Australia, the native dung beetles that they had there were unable to utilize the cattle poop because it was much wetter than the poop that's produced by something like a marsupial. So they actually had to import dung beetles from elsewhere to help manage that waste load from that introduced cattle. So they really are important for keeping our environments nice and tidy. They also aerate and return nutrients to the soil. Termites and ants, which are really important, especially in tropical ecosystems, apparently can turn infertile land into cropland within a year by aerating the soil, which helps that soil retain water and returns nutrients to that soil. So that's also a very important service. Another thing they do is they regulate plant and animal community structure. A lot of insects feed on plants, and you can imagine if those insects disappeared, that plants would very quickly take over the world. In terms of regulating animal community structure, insects are pretty important vectors of disease. If you think about things like mosquitoes carrying malaria or other parasites. So this kind of helps maintain, it's like a population balance for animal communities as well. And then they pollinate, of course. They pollinate most flowering plants, and we will get into that a little bit more now. So these are all pictures of pollinators on local plants. They were all taken in the last few weeks. As you can see, there are a large diversity of insect pollinators. This is a scarab hunter wasp here. Over here, we've got a metallic wood boring beetle. So a lot of the time when we think of insect pollinators, we think of butterflies and bees, but really there's a large number of beetles and wasps and flies that also do a bulk of the pollination work. The reason that bees are thought of most often as pollinators is because they're actually really great at pollinating. A lot of insects just show up on a flower for the nectar, which is the sugary resource that the flower produces, but bees will actually actively collect pollen. You can see they've got all these amazing fuzzy hairs. This one has them on his legs. These guys will have them on their tummies. So that enables them to collect pollen, and the female bees will bring that pollen back to a nest to feed a developing larva. So that's part of the reason that bees are such efficient pollinators. So as I was saying, insects are responsible for pollinating almost 300,000 angiosperms, which is just a fancy word for flowering plants. That's about 85% of flowering plants. So they really are crucial for helping plants to exchange their genetic information. This insect will land on the plant, pick up some pollen from the anthers, which are these male pollen-producing reproductive structures, fly to another plant, hopefully of the same species, and if it happens to come in contact with the female reproductive structures, those pollen grains will hopefully make it down the pollen tube to the ovaries, where the seeds will then develop. All right. So now that we understand a little bit about why insects are important for ecosystems, let's talk about why they are important to people. Wild insects, there's a study by Losey and Vaughn in 2006, and they estimated that wild insects were worth about $57 billion per year, and that's in the US alone. To put that into context a little bit, that's equivalent to about the GDP of a country like Uruguay. And while it's only about half of the net worth of Jeff Bezos, it's still quite a substantial sum of money. So in that paper, the services that they included in this estimation were pollination, pest control. Pest control is also very important in agricultural settings mostly. I really love this picture here. You may or may not know that predatory insects and parasitoid insects are used frequently to control pest populations in agricultural crops. In this example here, this adult ladybug is feeding on an aphid. Ladybugs are great at pest control because their larval stage is also predatory and will devour all these little aphids. But over here, you can see that there are some kind of golden colored aphids, and this one has a hole in it. These aphids have been parasitized by a tiny little wasp, and the wasp has hatched out of this little hole here. So insects are incredibly important in the control of pest bugs in agriculture. Dung burial, we already talked a little bit about why that's important for the cattle industry specifically. And then another service included in this estimate was animal nutrition. So that's just wild insects. Managed agricultural insects contribute about $230 billion per year to the world's economy. And this figure is from 2009, so that is not adjusted for inflation, and it's actually also converted from euro, but that's a large sum of money, and the bulk of that is probably honeybees, but there are other bees used in agriculture that are immensely important for pollinating crops. So let's look at some of those crops that are reliant on insects. This map here is showing what percentage of crops around the world, are pollinated by insects. So you can see here in the US, it's anywhere from about 5 to 10% of the crops grown here rely on insects as pollinators. So when we're thinking about what kinds of crops need insects as pollinators, it's usually kind of our fruits and vegetables. A lot of our grains are wind pollinated and do not rely on animals. But something like bumblebees might be used to pollinate blueberries. Bumblebees are especially popular for pollinating tomatoes in greenhouses. Almonds rely on honeybees for pollination, as do most apple orchards. Even chocolate is insect pollinated. It's actually pollinated by a little fly called a cacao midge. So without fly pollinators, we wouldn't have something delicious like chocolate to enjoy. So it's estimated that 15 to 30% of the US diet is a result of indirect or direct animal-mediated pollination. So that's, that's a pretty substantial amount of the food that we consume. So now that we understand a little bit about why insects are important both in the environment and for our food security, let's start talking about these recent claims of decline that have been flying around the media. It can always sound a little bit scary at times, so let's dig in and look at some of the research around insect declines. So this graphic is from the Bee Informed Partnership, which is a USDA-funded study to track honeybee losses in the United States. Most of you have probably heard of colony collapse disorder. It was probably when reports of honeybee losses started circulating, that people really did start considering the impact of pollinators on our food supply. And the Bee Informed Partnership has been tracking these honeybee hive losses since 2006, I think. And as you can see from this graph, anywhere from a quarter to a half of honeybee colonies are lost every single year, which is pretty substantial sum of colonies. You can see here in New Mexico, the winter of 2008 and 2009, we were sitting at about 40% loss. So that's quite a large number. And honeybees have traditionally been responsible for the bulk of commercial agricultural pollination services. And it's thought that they contribute about $20 billion to the value of US crop production. And that's mostly because they enhance the number of seeds that get set and the fruit that gets produced. So let's talk a little bit about wild insect losses. This graphic is from a Sanchez-Bayo and Wyquez study that came out in 2019, I think. And this study basically ran a search of all of the literature coming out over the last few years that has shown insect declines. And they found 73 different papers reporting declines around the globe. Each of these little bars represents a different study, and the color is showing us which group that study was on. So all of the yellow bars are the Hymenoptera, which are our bees, and this isn't distinguishing between wild bees and managed bees, so I would guess that the bulk of these studies are on managed bees. Then we also have purple is Lepidoptera. Those are our butterflies and moths. And as you can see, there are quite a lot of studies on Lepidoptera coming out of Europe. They have very extensive butterfly monitoring schemes in Europe, and they have for a long time. So there's a lot of really great long-term data there to look at. The US is starting to catch up in that respect. You can see we've got a couple studies coming out. So hopefully in a few years, we will be able to show what's going on with our butterfly populations as well. Our flies are in green, the Diptera here, they're not studied very much. Coleoptera, those are our beetles. And then we've got aquatic with macro inverts, things like dragonflies, those are our blue bars. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot of data from around the globe. It's mostly concentrated in Europe and the US. All right, so the first study I'm going to talk about, this is a study that came out of Germany in 2017, and it was a long-term study done at nature reserves, and it revealed a 76% decline in total flying insect biomass. And National Geographic actually reported on this recently, and this was the graphic that they used to display that data. And I think it's a really great way to think about what a 70% decline looks like. I mean, look at the number of insects that were around in 1989, and now there's hardly anything. And this is at nature reserves too. So it was actually this paper that was sort of a wake-up call to the community, and this is the one that the media sources picked up and really ran with. It was kind of around this time too that people started talking about the windshield effect. I don't know if you've maybe heard of that. There are, anecdotal reports 30 years ago, you fly around or drive around at night, or even, take a long road trip in the summer, and your car gets covered in dead insects. And now we have very few issues with that. So where have all these insects gone? It's pretty concerning. The drivers of decline in this study were not identified. while this study was done at nature reserves in Germany, Germany is very heavily agricultural, and I don't think the nature reserves are very large. So the reserves are probably not large enough to shield the insects or the wildlife from what other effects might be going on in the landscape. So, looking at some wild pollinator losses, this is a study that came out of Britain on hoverflies and wild bees, and they found that hoverflies and bees had decreased about 25% from 1980 to 2013. If you're not familiar with hoverflies, they are delightful little insects. They're probably my favorite flies. They're wonderful because not only are the adults pollinators of flowers, but the larvae are very predaceous, and they're often used in biocontrol to control pest insects. So they're kind of a double whammy for agriculture. And as you can see, they look a lot like a wasp or a bee because of their coloration. So they're very often confused for bees or wasps. So one interesting thing that this study revealed was that actually solitary bee species were suffering steeper declines than social bees. Social bees in this case is mostly bumblebees. And the authors of the study likened this because of a lot of agri-environmental schemes that have been initiated in England to try and promote pollinator health. So maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel with this study, because some of these agri-environmental schemes are actually starting to help the species that they are designed to help. Upland species in this study were also more heavily impacted than lowland species. And this may be because of climate change impacts. There are a lot of range contractions happening because of climate change. And as a species moves further and further north, they're disappearing from those southern ends of their range. And this might be leading to some declines in these populations. All right, let's move over to the US. There's a researcher based in California named Art Shapiro, and he has been collecting data on California butterflies at the same sites since the 1970s. So this long-term data set is very unique and very valuable. And this study showed that the majority of species at 3 sites, the 3 sites are all in the Central Valley of California. If you go out today, you will record fewer butterflies than you would have 30 years ago. And these graphs, these boxes each represent 1 site. So these first 2 sites have been surveyed since the 1990s. And then this 3rd site has been surveyed since 1975. And this is the fraction of days observed per year. So this species, Danaus plexippus, this is actually the monarch butterfly, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And as you can see, for example, in 1975, when you go out and do a survey, you see a monarch 60% of the days you're out there, while in 2006 or 7, you go out and you see a monarch maybe 10% of the time. And keep in mind, the Central Valley of California is very agricultural. It's also experiencing a lot of urban growth. So this study didn't really show exactly what the drivers of decline were, but a lot of species of butterflies do seem to be experiencing declines. So again, let's look back at this map again. A lot of the media reports coming out on insect declines are claiming that there's worldwide catastrophic loss of insects. And while that may very well be true, we do not have the data yet to back that claim up. So like I mentioned before, a lot of the studies coming out are from the US or from Europe, and about 80% of insect biodiversity resides in the tropics. So with very few studies actually coming out of the tropics, we can't really say that worldwide these declines are happening. There is one study, there are a few studies out of the tropics, but one in particular was really interesting. They looked at insect biomass in Luquillo rainforest, and it had declined by 10 to 60% from 1976 to 2013. And what was really neat about this study is they also looked at what the lizard, frog, and bird populations were doing. And these three groups of species rely heavily on invertebrates in their diets, and they actually found synchronous declines in these species as well. One of the scary things about some of the studies coming out of the tropics, a lot of them are implicating climate change in declines. And if you think about the temperature and weather patterns in the tropics, they tend to be a lot more stable and less variable than places like the temperate regions. So scientists are starting to think that species in the tropics are less able to deal with fluctuations in temperature, which leaves them a lot more vulnerable to the warming temperatures that we are starting to see around the globe. All right, so those are, some of the studies showing us what's going on with insects. Now let's start talking a little bit about why some insects might be in decline. So first, habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. Habitat loss is usually happening due to things like agricultural expansion or growing cities or resource extraction. For example, about 40% of the Earth's land is covered in agricultural lands. So, that's a huge percentage of habitat that has been lost. Let's see. Pesticides and other environmental pollutants. So insecticides are designed to kill insects. That's kind of the point. So they have direct lethal effects on insects, and they're indiscriminate. So often they end up killing organisms that they're not targeting. So this can be a huge issue. Herbicides have also been implicated in some declines, mostly by changing habitats. If you think of an example like the monarch butterfly, milkweed is the monarch butterfly's larval host. And due to the herbicide glyphosate, which has been sprayed a lot more heavily the last few decades because of Roundup ready crops in the Midwest, milkweed is also disappearing. And researchers think that that's likely why monarch populations are suffering so much. So herbicides, while they don't directly kill insects, can still have huge impacts. Invasive species, this is another really important driver of decline. I've done some work on Hawaiian moth species, and in Hawaii there are a couple predatory ants that have been introduced, which have been pretty terrible for the native moths. There were also some wasps introduced for biocontrol of caterpillars on palm and coconut crops. And these wasps also attack a lot of native insects. So some of the problems for Hawaiian moths are related to the introduction of invasive species. Another really interesting example of invasive species driving declines, there used to be 2 species of bumblebee managed commercially here in the US, the eastern bumblebee and the western bumblebee. The eastern bumblebee was taken over to Europe for some breeding studies, and when it came back, researchers are starting to think that it had Nosema bombi, which is a fungal pathogen it had picked up in Europe. And when those colonies were released into the US, it seems like that pathogen escaped and crossed over to some North American bumblebees that are now facing pretty drastic declines. So invasive species are certainly problematic. Light and noise pollution is another big driver of decline. Nocturnal insects are less studied than their diurnal counterparts, but scientists are starting to uncover how light pollution might be interfering with bioluminescent mating displays, like in fireflies, for example. Light might also interfere with migration patterns. Insects might use the light of the moon or the stars to navigate. So a lot of these pollutants are turning out to be pretty devastating to certain kinds of insects. And then, of course, climate change. We already talked about how climate change might be implicated in declines of some tropical insects. And then with rain shifts, how that might lead to decline, such as the bees in the UK. But climate change might also lead to phenological mismatch, which basically, if you think about an insect and a plant that flowers that insect relies on, that plant and the insect might rely on different environmental cues. So the insect might rely on a temperature cue. The temperature will drive its development and it'll hatch out at a certain time depending on how warm it is, whereas the cue for the plant might be sunlight. So if it's warming up more quickly, but the sunlight isn't changing, then that is leading to some mismatches between insects and their host plants. So these are all of the threats. Let's go over this first. So this is a quote from E.O. Wilson. He is a famous entomologist as well as a conservationist. And he says, the truth is we need invertebrates, but they do not need us. And this is very true. Insects have survived 3 mass extinction events before. And like we talked about earlier, they're very successful organisms. As a whole, they won't be going anywhere anytime soon. But it is true that we are losing biomass and abundance of insects. We're losing diversity. We're losing unique ecological functions. We're losing networks of biotic interactions, and we're losing food security. And because our destiny is so intertwined with that of insects, we really must start valuing them as essential for the sake of ourselves, as well as the insects, of course. So let's think just briefly what the world without insects would look like. Species that consume insects would suffer population losses. Waste and decomposing organisms would persist in the environment, and nutrients would not be made available for other uses. Soils would become unfertile, and deserts would expand, crops would fail. 75% of agricultural crops and 90% of flowering plants would be unable to reproduce, and insect pest outbreaks would increase as natural controls are diminished. So now let's think about what we can do to help insects. It turns out we actually can do quite a lot to help insects. The first thing that I would suggest is just notice where the insects are around your house. And if you're more conscientious of where they are and what what they're doing, you might be able to help protect them a little bit better. You can mow your lawn less frequently or get rid of it. When you don't mow your lawn, there's, maybe some clover in there that might flower and attract bees. Or grass, there are a lot of larval caterpillars that would feed on the grass. So really just letting your lawn go wild can be a great way to attract insects to your yard. Plant native plants, this one's really important. As I was saying, habitat loss is extremely detrimental to insects and a lot of other organisms right now. And by planting native plants that, native insects have co-evolved with, you are bringing back their food source and in a lot of cases their source of shelter. So this is a really great way to attract insects to your yard. You can leave old stumps, logs, and dead leaves in place. There are a lot of insects that will burrow into rotting wood. It acts as a really great shelter over the winter. You can stop spraying pesticides. I know that's hard here in Albuquerque. We get a lot of cockroaches that we don't want coming into our homes. But we can minimize spraying pesticides as much as possible. We can also turn off our porch lights at night, maybe opt for motion sensor activated lights. Like I was saying earlier, urban light pollution is hugely distracting to a lot of insects. So that's just at the local scale. Let's look at what we might be able to do at the global scale. Reducing our carbon footprint, this is beneficial for all life. And like we were talking about, climate change has a lot of implications for wildlife. So reducing our carbon footprint can help. Think about where your food comes from. If you go local or grow your own, you don't have to worry as much about the pesticides that might be used like in a more industrial agricultural setting. You can join a citizen science initiative. I've got a list in just a few slides of some of the initiatives you can join around here that will help scientists know what kind of abundance and diversity of organisms we have in our cities and in our parks and in our nearby nature habitats. So that can be immensely helpful for researchers. You can donate to wildlife conservation organizations. Be conscientious of keeping species where they belong. Be mindful of, try not to introduce things places they shouldn't be. You can elect leaders who have an environmental agenda, and you can be an advocate for insects and educate others. And I think today you can check that one off your list just for listening to this talk. So, like I said earlier, I work for the New Mexico Biopark Society. So I wanted to talk just briefly about what the biopark is doing about pollinator declines. As I said, my coworkers and I assess conservation status of species and get them on the red list. I work specifically with insects. The IUCN red list has only assessed about 8,400 species of insect, which is only 0.2% of insect species. As we talked about earlier, there's more than 1 million species of insects. So through my work, I've been working to assess groups like Hawaiian moths, and I've done a few local butterfly species, and I've also worked on a project assessing North American firefly species. So the New Mexico Biopark Society is trying to do as much as possible for wildlife conservation. So these are some of the citizen science initiatives I talked about earlier. This is the New Mexico Butterfly Monitoring Network is a brand new initiative that started at the biopark just this year. if you are interested in doing butterfly surveys, you can go to this website and reach out to me. We'd love to have you. Then these are some other ones: Monarch Watch, Bumblebee Watch, and iNaturalist. And that's it. Let me look at some questions. Bumblebee Watch and iNaturalist.
We have a question about, we know people raise butterflies and release them into the garden or backyard. Is this another way people can help out locally? Any good bug kits you recommend?
It depends where you're getting the butterflies from. If you're interested in learning about butterfly life cycles, you could go out and, find a caterpillar and find out what its host plant is, bring it into your house and watch it go through its life cycle. That can be a really cool educational tool. But in terms of some of the bigger commercial providers, I wouldn't necessarily suggest releasing those kinds of insects into the environment because they aren't really naturally occurring, if that makes sense.
If you would like to ask Anna Walker a question, you can type it into the YouTube chat box or below at the comments. Thank you.
I'm not really seeing the questions, Estrita. If there's any more coming, let me know.
Not any at this moment.
Okay.
We can stay on for maybe a little, 10 more minutes. And if anybody has any questions, thank you for attending this virtual presentation.
I see a question from Clayton Meredith. He said, can you recommend any resources or books for those who want to learn more about the pollinators in our backyards? Of course, there is a book called The Bees in Our Backyards by Olivia Messenger Carroll, who actually gave a presentation on bees yesterday, and she's got a co-author too, but that's a beautiful book. A lot of really great pictures and a lot of really great information about wild bees. There's also a guide for butterflies called Butterflies of the Southwest by Brock, I think is the author on that one. And that's a really good resource for just some of the most common butterflies that you might see around. And then of course the internet. The internet is full of really great resources. Bug Guide is a good one for kind of any insects that you might have. You can post pictures and an expert can help you figure out what you've got.
Anna, what would you recommend viewers to do if they wanted to get more involved with helping out their native pollinators? Just small things that they could start.
Yeah, I think my number one recommendation would go to a native plant nursery and just start planting native plants in your yard. you know, that's a pretty easy thing we can all do, and it makes a huge difference. So we're basically just creating more habitat for them when we do this. And even if your space is tiny, like even just one plant can be super helpful.
Maybe we could go back to not your references slide, but the one before that, which listed the New Mexico butterfly tracking program,
Yeah.
so that anybody who is watching can take down those links. We have a question from Val T. Can you tell us a little more about the citizen science initiatives and what they entail?
Yeah, so the New Mexico Butterfly Monitoring Network is brand new this year, so it's kind of just getting off the ground, but it's part of a larger nationwide network that has a standardized protocol to track butterfly and abundance sort of long term. So, you know, over the years, some of these programs have been gathering a lot of data, and now we're finally starting to analyze that data, and it's giving us some really great information on trends as well as what sort of habitats butterflies are doing great in, what sort of habitats they might be struggling in. So this is a really cool way to contribute to really valuable science. Monarch Watch, I'm not as familiar with that one. We don't have a whole lot of monarch butterflies here in New Mexico, although we definitely have some. But most of these other initiatives, if you go out into your backyard or wherever and you take a picture of a monarch butterfly or a caterpillar or a bumblebee or any other organism in the case of iNaturalist, you can submit it to that website, and an expert will get on there and get some other information from you, like where you took the photo, what time of day it was, what the date was. And then those records can be really useful for researchers to, you know, answer some questions about where these organisms are and where they used to be. So these, you know, they're really great ways that we can all help contribute to meaningful research.
Thanks, Anna. We have a few more minutes. If anybody has any other questions, you can type them into the chat box, and I'll be sure that Anna gets to them. Thank you for joining us today, everybody. Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Anna, for this wonderful presentation during their pollinator celebration.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope everybody learned something about pollinators. Thank you very much for having me.